Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And one of the things I really love about what we do on this channel is we don't shy away from complexity. In today's show, we are looking at the fascinating but complicated history of a city on the Baltic coast that was the epicenter of a battle between two ideologies. Nicole Eaton teaches at Boston College, and her book, German Blood, Slavic Soil, came out last year. To purchase the book, you can find links in the description below, or you can use your favorite bookstore in person or online. I'll bring her in now. Good morning to you where you are, Nicole. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
So my first question to a new guest is how you like to define yourself: military historian, social historian, analyst, researcher, educator. Have you got a preferred label?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I usually just say historian. I don't specify the kind. And I went to Berkeley for grad school, which has a reputation for being sort of a hotbed of cultural history, radicalism, and kind of today would be called critical race theory central. But I was trained by rather conventional historians, and so and I also never really thought about the historiography and the labels. So I've just always been an historian. I happen to be interested in war and society. Sometimes that touches on the military. Sometimes that touches on other topics. Yeah.
Well, we'll get into kind of definitions and things as we go through the show, because that's one of the things that drew me to this subject is as I said on the top of the show there, the complexity of it. And, people like their military history with clear good guys and clear bad guys and a neat tied up package of here comes the victory and a liberation parade and some of the subjects. When you get to the Baltics areas and some of the areas of the Southeast Asia, things don't end in a neat tied up package. It just kind of morphs into other period of history. So before we bring up your PowerPoint, what drew you to this subject? Was it the complexity and that was exciting?
Yeah, I think you got it exactly. I have really been fascinated for a long time with this idea of good guys and bad guys, especially when you look at this complicated part of the world. You see that there are many different ways to tell the story, and we see that today with the Russia's war in Ukraine, and with all of the Baltic states and all of the Soviet successor states, how they have completely different World War II myths from Russia about what happened, even though they were the same soldiers fighting on the same side. And likewise, I originally went to grad school to study Austrian history, and I was told that was really out of fashion and nobody cared about that anymore, which was funny to me because there are a lot of great books now about Habsburg history. And I really was interested in the breakup of multi-ethnic empires in this sort of East Central Europe part of the world, where there are all kinds of people speaking different languages, different ideologies, different national identities, all coming together in this space, late 19th century, early 20th century, up to the Second World War. And I strayed away from Austrian history. I started learning Russian in grad school and got really fascinated with history of socialism, with communism and Stalinism in particular, because it's such a good idea has gone so horribly wrong. I mean, one of the greatest tragedies of the century, just the mass death caused by Soviet socialism. And yet they wanted to liberate humanity. I was really interested in that. And then how I came to this topic in particular is that, I had learned German, I had learned Russian, and I was always interested in this long, multiple centuries dialogue between Russia and Germany, between the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the peoples going back and forth. And it seemed to me that there was this one city, as I'm going to point out in my talk, one city that was actually in both regimes, not just during the war, but before the war and after. That was in Stalin's Soviet Union and in Hitler's Third Reich. And this one place became this, as I say, an epicenter, this real center of the encounter between these two regimes and the ideologies and the people in often very violent and tragic ways that I explore in the book.
Well, brilliant introduction. So I'll bring up the PowerPoint, and folks, we want to keep this nice and interactive today. So fire away with questions, and we'll address them as we go along. But it is complicated, but it's also fascinating, and that's one of the things that drew Nicole to me. So over to you.
Yeah, and yes, thank you, everybody. It's a very complex story. If there's anything that doesn't make sense, please interrupt. I love questions, and it helps me gauge what's interesting to you. And so, as Paul mentioned, this is a book about this one place that really does help us understand this encounter between Nazism and Stalinism, between Hitler and Germany. And it is a history of a city and a region at the same time. And it is, as you all know and have probably tried to and have experienced, there are more books written about the Second World War than can be written in a lifetime, or that can be read in a lifetime. And that's doubly true or equally true about books about Nazism and Stalinism and Hitler and Germany and in the Eastern Front. There are just so many books, and so many of them tend to be, really great stories of either military history, or there are stories of Holocaust and genocide studies, or there are these, like Bloodlands, think of Timothy Snyder, these very top-down Hitler and Stalin in Moscow, in Berlin, and then very micro on the ground violence, like what happens. And there's this kind of thing, this top down and the bottom up. Sometimes it's hard to tell the connections of those. And so what I think is really interesting about this one city that was the, is that it really does help us see the mechanisms of how this war played out. And so I do a longue durée history. I'll talk a little bit about that, which means, sort of the whole first half of the 20th century, but it really does zoom in on the period of the war. So I want to go into that. Can you go ahead to the next slide? And so here's a map just to orient us. There'll be a few more other maps. So you can see after the First World War, as is very infamous now, the Polish corridor was created. And so this is this region to the, I'm pointing at the screen, East Prussia, where that red arrow is, that northern part of what was former East Prussia is what becomes Kaliningrad after the war. And so that's the region I'm talking about. And this is such a fascinating place in terms of thinking about East Central Europe in the 20th century, because it was, this place is like the borderland between the Russian and German Empire. And when those two break up, it becomes this kind of leftover place, an exclave. We use the word enclave more often, but exclave means it's kind of like in Alaska, for those of you who are in the US, a place that is part of the regime, but separated geographically from it. And so that's what East Prussia became. And it became, one of the main, problems of Versailles was this territory that was part of Germany and not connected to it. And so throughout the 20th century, this region became an exclave many times. It ended up being this sort of outlier of the Soviet Union. It's an exclave of Russia today. That little part that is still Kaliningrad Oblast is surrounded by EU and NATO. And as I mentioned, this northern third here that becomes Kaliningrad was the only territory that was both in the Third Reich and in the Soviet Union. And it was the first territory in 1944, and then again in 1945, that the Soviet Union entered the first German territory as it marched toward Berlin. And that meant it was also the site of the most violent retribution as Soviet soldiers mass raped German women. And I know you've had Voin Maestrovich, who talked about the problem of rape in Soviet soldiers. And this was the site of the highest violence against German civilians. But it also, quite interestingly, and this is something I spend nearly half of the book on, is the site of the longest and largest cohabitation between German civilians and Soviet civilians and military after the war. And they lived together, the remaining German civilians who couldn't leave before the Red Army's advance, or chose not to, or some of them even came back in the summer of 45. They lived together for over 3 years until the Germans were expelled, which is a real anomaly in the history of post-war German civilians. East Central Europe. Most of all had been expelled by 46 in other regions. So go ahead to the next slide. I was actually go back to the last slide. I forgot to talk about those pictures, if you can. And so you can see here, they're small. I was originally going to write a comparative history of this place to show what the Nazis had done, like how they organized government, how did they organize schools, how did they organize churches, etc. How did they inflict violence, how did ordinary civilians respond? And then I was going to do the very same thing and say, how did they do it in Stalinism, and then what I realized, very naive grad student I was that the circumstances were so different because of the war. And you can see here just one wartime, pre-war and post-war photo, is that 60% of the city was destroyed. There was the extreme violence of the occupation. It made absolutely no sense to do a static comparative history. So go ahead now to the next slide. What I ended up doing was what is called in German historiography often an entangled history. So to show how Nazism and Stalinism, Germany and Russia, and the people, the very people who lived there and came there were entangled, how they were involved in each other, how they were thinking about each other, how they were reacting to each other and defining themselves against each other. And so that's what this ends up being. And something that I hope we can talk more about, and that Paul and I have already talked about, is, you know, there hadn't been an English language history of this place. Isabel Denny had a history called the Fall of Hitler's Fortress City, which wasn't very well researched and you know, sort of uneven, but there hadn't been a big history of either what happened before the war, during the war, or after. And there had been a little snippets of it in German history, especially the pre-war period. There had been memoirs on the Soviet side and then the Russia side today, also little snippets, but there's not been a big grand history of this. But what I did notice when reading the memoirs, when reading the diaries, when reading the letters, the primary sources, the oral histories, and whatever histories had been written by historians, they all have a sense of who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. The Germans were evil fascists and Hitler followers, and they deserved it. And the Soviets were heroes and liberators, or the reverse. The Soviets were these brutal, you know, Slavic barbarians. Sometimes they would even use sort of Nazi racial tropes to describe them, Asiatic, and that the German civilians were undeserving victims, double victims of both the Nazi regime and of the Soviet revenge. And for me to try to balance that story and look into how each side understood themselves, how they understood each other, that was a huge piece of what I was doing.
And just a question for you, Nicole. Do you think
Sure,
the fact that these earlier books had a clear kind of baddie is maybe they were aiming their books at a particular market? So they were aiming it at the German market or the English speaking market or the Soviet market. So therefore they labeled that clearly to define it for that audience, whereas you're looking more at a global, everybody to read it, to understand it.
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think a lot of them were products of the Cold War. And so the market in West Germany was not only the people who themselves had been there and experienced that, who were then reading about that story, and also then their children. It had a Cold War mission. It was to show, you know, in the German lands, you know, West German lands anyway, to show that the Soviet Union had been the worst of those two totalitarian regimes. You know, and the Soviet Union, it was the same thing. It was a mission to show, I mean, they were actually showing after the war that they had been humane to the Germans. It was part, you know, to create this myth of a sort of friendship of the peoples, you know, but they still wanted to emphasize how complicit and guilty the Germans were. You know, they then obscured the fact that they had done this mass raping, and it's still very much taboo today to talk about in Russia. Yeah, it was absolutely, I think, part of a market issue and a Cold War issue. But I think what I also noticed in terms of the historians who have done some really good, serious research is very few of them were looking at documents on all sides. They happen to be experts on German history, or they're experts on Russian history. Sometimes they had both languages. Often they didn't. And so there's a really good military history, much more actual legit military history. Bastian Willems, who has just come out about the Wehrmacht in East Prussia. And it's a great book. He only looks at German sources, and he looks at military sources. And so he tells a story about Wehrmacht agency. Like, the Wehrmacht is responsible for the civilian tragedy in East Prussia. The Wehrmacht was violent. The Wehrmacht continued its scorched earth policies, and that all makes sense. But he wants to blame a lot of what happened after the war on the Wehrmacht. But when you actually look at the documents from the Soviet side, you can see that the Soviets are just as responsible for the tragedy that unfolds after 45. So it really depends on what sources you have access to. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next slide. And so this is, again, the book cover, which I think they did a great job on. And so I told them to make it evocative of blood and soil, make it evocative of a city that was both a bridge to the east and a bulwark against it. And so you see some images of fortresses, of bridges, and of veins and roots, which I found really just a wonderful illustration of what happens in the book. And so I'm not going to go through this chapter by chapter, but for those of you who are looking, you can see it color-coded. The two white chapters cover the German period. They start in the 1920s, go into the 1930s as Königsberg's empire expands, and I'll explain that in a bit. The middle chapters first take a German perspective on the fall of the city, and a German civilian perspective in particular, and then take a Soviet perspective and look at Red Army soldiers. And there hadn't been much work done on that in English, at least not for a popular audience, to really take seriously what Soviet soldiers thought they were doing when they were taking their revenge. And the final three chapters look at the post-war period, rebuilding this city from the ruins, and they go very much in detail into the period of 1945 to 48. Okay, brilliant. Go ahead. From there. So I'm going to go through the history of the city now, and this is so exciting for me because I've given some book talks at universities, and they're less interested in the details of what happened, and they're more interested in like, what did you argue? Who are you arguing against? And so it's just fun to nerd out and actually talk about the details of. Yeah,
you're in nerd paradise here. We're all nerds together. We proudly wear our geek badges, and we're not embarrassed about it.
That's great. Yeah, and so I usually have given this talk for an audience that may not know why World War II is important, other than sort of knowing that it's History Channel topic. So this city, Königsberg, was the lifelong home of Immanuel Kant, and it assumes all kinds of importance in a lot of German myths, especially those that come from Königsberg itself, saying that this was the birthplace of the German monarchy, or because it was founded by the Teutonic Knights in the Middle Ages, that it has a sort of deep Prussian and Teutonic ancestry here. And it was a city that had a really great sense of self-importance because it was this bridge to East and West, because it was a center of the German Enlightenment in the East. But it was also a city in great decline. It was decimated in the Napoleonic Wars. It, over the course of the 19th century, didn't fully recover from that. And although it was also a Hanseatic League trading port and had lots of grain trade in particular because of the agricultural hinterlands, and there would be all kinds of trade from the Russian Empire going to the Russian Empire, it was the case already before the First World War that this was a city in economic decline as globalization was changing the way that agriculture worked and industry, and it was not a highly industrialized region like the Ruhr Valley or Silesia because it just didn't have the natural resources. So this was a sort of a loser in global transformation in the early 20th century. What happened in World War I was that all of the ports were cut off. Trade between Russian and German empires declined, of course, as the two empires at war with each other. And then East Prussia was the only real site of World War I battles on German soil, which often gets forgotten. But this was very much part of the mythos of East Prussians and Königsbergers because the front lines were within 100, maybe 60 kilometers of Königsberg, and just all kinds of, Battle of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes and the rest, where Hindenburg became famous, of course, right? But really shaped this province's identity. And then after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russian Revolution of 1917, there was a sense, because of that military invasion in 1914-15, because of the Bolshevik Revolution, and think there's the Polish Bolshevik Civil War, happening nearby. There were communist uprisings from within, a sort of red Soviet republic briefly declared in Königsberg before it was put down. There was a sense of a fear of incursion on all sides. It could be from communist revolution or communist sympathizers. It could be from foreign militaries. It could be even from the neighboring Poles or Lithuanians, because there were new Polish and Lithuanian states that had been founded from the rump of the Russian Empire, and they very much wanted to claim this territory for their own.
Another quick question for you. Does it have, or did it have, that kind of typical port identity of places like Liverpool and Shanghai and Antwerp around the world and Alexandria that always kind of the first places to hear about things happening in other countries and new changes and new inventions and new ideas. Does it have that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was, and this is something I really play with in the book, because I use this imagery of bridge and bulwark, because there's some of you may be familiar. There's a history in the history of mathematics. There's a famous problem called the bridges of Königsberg, and it's a basically topology. Can you get through all 7 bridges of the city only once without crossing a bridge twice? And so it turns out you couldn't back when there were 7 bridges. So I use the imagery of bridge and bulwark because the city is varyingly, because it's a port city, but because it was also founded as a fortress for plunder. It has these sort of alternating identities and tension. Is it facilitating trade with the world as a port city, or it is a center of enlightenment and culture and crossroads of everything and multi-ethnic, etc.? Or is it a fortress of Germandom? And the same thing plays out after the war and even today in Kaliningrad, because there was also a sense of it being they used more of the imagery of a lighthouse, but it was also a port city, and sometimes, that port city did or didn't mean a lot of things, but the places, port cities, vitality depends on trade, and war is the most devastating thing for a port city. And so this was also the case in Königsberg. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead to the next slide. And so on the left, you can see a map from the book. I think they did great maps. I wanted them to have the little serifs, but they had to take them out. So anyway, I wanted to look old fashioned. They couldn't give me that. As you can see here, this is after the war. Should be, those of you who know World War II are very familiar with this story. In order to give this newly independent Polish state access to the Baltic Sea, they made this 20 to 70 kilometer wide strip, this Polish corridor, as it's now called, and made Danzig a free state. They also, often not talked about, you can see there that little territory up to the north of East Prussia ceded to Lithuania. That's the region that is called either the Klaipėda region or Memeland, the Memel region. Was also a League of Nations protectorate, but then Lithuania actually went in. Some Lithuanian militarized guards went in and took the territory, and the French allowed it to happen, and so they annexed it to Lithuania in 1923. The region, that shaded area of plebiscite, this part of East Prussia remained in Germany, and all of East Prussia remained in Germany. But in 1920, they were forced to have a vote to determine the national self-determination of the province. And that was the big language of Versailles, of World War I, of Wilson, right? National self-determination. You get to pick who you are. 98% of the population voted to remain in East Prussia, which is phenomenal. And actually, international observers deemed it to be more or less fair. And that was an accurate representation of the population's true conscience. What's really fascinating about that is that area of that plebiscite, about 47% of the population, depending on some estimates, were speakers of Polish. They could also be speakers of German, but they were speakers of what is now called what was even then called the Masurian dialect of Polish. But they were loyal to the Prussian state and to the German state because they tended to be Protestant. They tended to be Lutheran and not Catholic, and they associated Polishness not with Polish language, but with Catholicism. In any case, this is part of what helped create this sense of siege mentality, the thought that the victors of World War I were trying to dismantle East Prussia, forcing this plebiscite, also that there were Polish, and this is indeed the case, Polish and Lithuanian nationalists trying to chip away at East Prussia and make it their own. And this sense of siege mentality led to really radical politics in the region, where Königsberg had been a socialist place. East Prussia had been sort of conservative agrarian. They turned immediately to nationalist parties, especially really anti-Semitic, xenophobic parties in the 1920s. Because this region was cut off, its economy was devastated. Go ahead to the next slide. And so a latecomer to this scene was Erich Koch, who became the Gauleiter or regional leader of East Prussia. the Nazis, despite the popularity of nationalist and anti-Semitic parties in East Prussia, the Nazis had their absolute worst showing in the Reich in 1928, which was already not a good election for the Nazis nationwide. They were the weakest of anywhere in East Prussia in 1928. Just months later, Erich Koch came. He was not from this region, and he would be distinguished by his accent, very much not an East Prussian accent. He was a charismatic figure. He looks like a sort of Nazi straight out of Central Casting, right? He has the little Schnauzer Hitler mustache under the nose. He was a really charismatic speaker, and he was able to take this sense of siege mentality, this fear of Poland, this fear of Bolshevism, and mobilize that for a very local message that really resonated with East Prussians. And he managed to grow the party tremendously. And by 1933, East Prussia went from being the absolute lowest turnout for the Nazis to the absolute highest anywhere in the Reich, and one of the few places that got an absolute majority, over 50% of the vote. So that's really attributed to his ability to craft this local message. And so over the course of the 1930s, Königsberg's local Nazis, those who had already been there and then sort of tied their fates to this newcomer, Erich Koch, imagined that they were going to create a local version of National Socialism. And they'd been drawing up plans even before 1933, even before they joined the Nazi Party. They had their own vision. And they were really interestingly, because of this region's agricultural backwardness, they had imagined themselves to be what they called Prussian socialists, and they were part of the left wing of the movement. They were actually, as was Erich Koch, they were anti-capitalist. They were Gregor Strasser followers, and so even though he was purged, they somehow survived. And they thought that they were going to basically dismantle capitalism and make this East Prussia on Königsberg, they called it the School of the Revolution, where the first new Reich would be kind of tried out and it would become a template, and then they would export it to Berlin. So they had great hubris, thinking that they were going to be basically the new center of Nazism, and they were going to sort of make the rebirth of German nation and then tell everybody else what to do. Very little of this actually happened when, they have huge economic plans. They even imagined sort of recasting sort of whole East German economic realm with the Soviet Union. So even though they hated Bolshevism, they hated communism, they hated Marx, they actually really liked the Soviet Union because they recognized, part of your port city question, that right, this place could only survive on trade, and that meant trade with the Soviet Union. But so they were going to carry out all of these very anti-capitalist plans, much more than the rest of the Nazis had imagined. Very little of it actually happened other than full employment, which was a big sort of propaganda PR move. But what they really did, and actually, I think you could make this case for Nazi Germany in practice everywhere, is that they redefined the terms for belonging to the German nation: inclusion and exclusion. Who got to be German? And we know that tragic story, and it played out very similarly in Königsberg, except that it wasn't as much a focus on the biology of Germanness, but on a sense of Germanness being willpower. You got to be German because you chose to be German. And that was very much coming out of that plebiscite, out of the fact that much of the province spoke Polish or had Lithuanian last names, and so they really said Germanness is a matter of will. But it's, of course, like the rest of Nazism, is totally contradictory, because there were a bunch of German Jews who were total ardent nationalist German conservative patriots, and they said, yes, we're German too. And they said, no, not you. Of course, no, not you. No, we meant everybody else who's who might accidentally be called Polish. They're totally German, but you cannot be German. And so this just really shows the arbitrariness of German race science and sort of a biological race, and that plays out quite a bit in my book. And so go ahead to the next slide. And so this is a map from the book. Something I found really fascinating was, because of this region's eastern proximity, sort of its position at the borderlands, between what was the Russian and German Empire, Erich Koch becomes the most powerful party boss in the Reich. He also becomes the head of the state, of the East Prussian province, so sort of, which was a sort of Prussian denomination, the way they organized the state. So he was the most powerful regional Nazi in all of the Reich, partly because this place was isolated. After 1939, with the start of the war, which was all, sort of based on a fictitious idea that Poland was attacking Germany, so that Germany is defensively attacking Poland. What they do is what they had promised to do ever since Versailles, which was reconnect East Prussia to the Reich. This was the ostensible reason for it, and so what ends up happening is, because Koch had demonstrated himself, even though he was really full of himself and had all kinds of hubris, he was incredibly loyal to Hitler, and Hitler trusted him and allowed him to, and East Prussia's Nazis, to annex first what you can see is number 4 on that map, and number 3. First number 4, which is the Zichenau region, as they called it. And so they took some Polish territory and annexed it directly to East Prussia. After 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, they took 3 and 5, which is the Bialystok region, and that they were also annexed to East Prussia as a sort of satellite territory, not organized with the other occupations. And then Koch was, as is known to many of you in the audience, was designated the Reichskommissar of this, or civilian leader of occupied Ukraine. What is really fascinating to me about this is that in all of these regions, you can see it stretching from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea, is an informal empire of East Prussian Nazis. Koch appointed his cronies, basically anyone who had been loyal to him. And so, for example, the mayor of Kiev was Königsberg's first Nazi, Walter Magunia, a baker. He just happened to found the Nazi party in 1921. Koch's associates fill all kinds of roles in the administration, in regional government, in Ukraine, etc. And so there should really be a study about that. There have been all kinds of studies about civilian rule and how they interact with the Wehrmacht, etc. But so much of the precedents of the Holocaust, like the euthanasia campaigns, the first ghettoizations, those are happening in those regions that were first annexed to East Prussia after 1939. Mm. And you can really see how some of those precedents were set regionally and then become national after that. So
just another quick question for you about status as a port. Ian Carr is asking about easier for third parties to trade through an adjacent neutral port than Königsberg, in that there are certain port cities around the world where they've got no competition. There's nothing up and down the coast for 1,000 miles in either direction. But here there are these other ports. So I'm imagining if you're trying to build that fear in a population of telling them that you might lose all your trade if you don't do this, and then suddenly we're nowhere. Yeah. Was that a possibility? Was that a real threat?
Yeah. Are we talking in like the 1920s, or are we talking in the 1930s?
20s, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. So basically, Königsberg's port networks, a lot of it was actually Mediterranean goods that had come around, and so Königsberg was a wine port. There's no wine being grown up that far north, but there were lots of red wines being traded there. The same with like marzipan, which is made from almonds. So it's a lot of Mediterranean products that would then go into the hinterland, and so it was more that there was nowhere to trade with. And so once the goods got to Königsberg, there was nowhere for them to go. And so Poland wasn't buying through them. Exactly. They were going to get goods through Gdansk. The same thing is that Lithuania also didn't have these trade networks established through Königsberg. They were going to get them through other ports. And so where it had been the sort of stopping ground to then go over land routes into the Russian Empire, none of that made sense anymore. Mostly because Poland had been closing the borders to East Prussia and sort of just blocking trade by design. Is sort of, I don't want to demonize Poland here. I mean, Poland had all kinds of reasons to fear its own existence, which came true. But both sides were doing tit for tat, trying to block trade. And so, a lot of bad faith partnerships here.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Yeah. So let's go ahead to the next slide. I find this one just to be utterly chilling. And so Koch is famous for his sort of bad health and his kind of Victorian cyclic constitution, and so he tended to spend most of the war in Königsberg, and he wasn't there sitting in Rovno or in Kiev. But when he did come, he sort of he would sort of have Ukrainians paraded around to him, and he was as Wendy Lauer, Alex Kay, Carol Burkhoff have all written, talking about Nazi Empire in Ukraine. Just a really notoriously brutal Reichskommissar. And it's interesting, in Soviet historiography, he doesn't feature very prominently, but in Ukrainian national memory, in Ukrainian historiography today, he's sort of a well-known entity, because he is really symbolic for oppression of Ukrainians in particular. Ukrainians actually were at a sort of slightly higher level than Russians because of the sort of divide and conquer politics of Nazi occupation. But it is the case that the occupation was especially brutal, and some of those brutal policies that they inflicted on the Jews and then on Ukrainians through forced labor, and on Slavs and other populations in Ukraine, they then bring some of that brutality back. This is this kind of concept of layered occupation. So the sort of escalation of violence, the breakdown of the rule of law, as the Red Army pushes East Prussia, sort of pushes basically the German Empire out of Ukraine, and it folds back onto East Prussia's borders. A lot of those tactics then come home to roost, And so I didn't make this argument myself. I think it was Alistair Noble. It's fun to nerd out. Alistair Noble pointed out that it was the first total war truly was on East Prussian soil. So even though Goebbels is declaring total war, after Stalingrad, is really the full mobilization of the East Prussian population to build the sort of ill-fated Ostwall, the eastern fortification walls that were of Koch's design with Wehrmacht support, that you see that the German population asked to do essentially what is forced labor light. And so let's go ahead to the next slide. And so the Red Army first made brief incursion into East Prussia, not even been known to the population, in August 1944, just for a couple hours. Again in October 1944, when that incursion, which was only for a couple of weeks, became infamous and was mobilized by Goebbels and the propaganda by the village of Nemmersdorf, a borderland village where there were signs of atrocity. Later, it was determined that the Nazis had, yes, indeed, there had been arson, pillage, but that the Nazis had dramatically overemphasized, for propaganda purposes, what had happened there. But they used it as a depiction of what would happen if the Germans gave up the fight. And so this was a sort of prelude to atrocity, the prelude to occupation. So the irony is that Nemmersdorf, as presented as this sort of, was presented as mass sexual violence and wanton, murder of children and rape of women. It actually hadn't happened to the degree in the way that the Nazis claimed, but when the Soviets came, they did precisely that. And so there's a real deep irony there that I do explore in the book. Here, though, however, so in January 1945, mid-January, the Soviets finally, after sort of being repulsed from the border twice before, launched their full-scale and final and successful invasion of Germany that leads to the end of the war in May. They march over East Prussia within a couple of weeks, covering almost the entire province. So the German resistance just crumbles, even though the Wehrmacht, there are all kinds of stories about Wehrmacht soldiers fighting futilely to push back the Red Army. Königsberg, by the end of January, was already encircled, except for a couple of roads that could go in and out. And it is inside this fortress city, as Hitler had declared it among some other German cities, ordered to hold out against all costs. It's inside this city that the SS starts to, along with the local party leadership, to bring the kind of terror policies to back home that they had used. And so they started to mass shoot the Jewish prisoners that they had already previously evacuated from the Stutthof concentration camp. And this, and then because they feared, sort of either an uprising from within or just to see that the Red Army would find the evidence of their mass death, they had so-called ordinary Germans, Hitler Youth, old Volkssturm militiamen, and village women march the remaining prisoners outside the city through that narrow passageway over to the village of Palmniken on the Baltic coast. There's recently been a film about this Palmniken massacre. It hadn't been talked about much because a lot of the archival record had been obscured, or because it was a territory that became Soviet, so there weren't many monuments built. But ordinary German civilians who had been just recently mobilized into the military as Hitler Youth, etc., forced over 3,000, some say as many as 5,000, of these prisoners, mostly women, some children, into the Baltic Sea coast to drown them, and their bodies would wash back on the shore, and they would try to escape, and then they would be shot. And so it's really interesting. I use this horrible story to talk about how in the memoirs, in the literature that emerge about East Prussia's final days, it's mostly German civilians talking about the really tragic loss of their homeland, loss of their families. They'll never go back to the place that had been the place where their families had lived for centuries, and the brutality of the Red Army and the undeservedness of the punishment if they remained in Kaliningrad or just go on the flight. They never talk about this story. They will say, we didn't have anything to do with Nazis, and we only had like 2 or 3 Ukrainians working for us, and we treated them well. Sort of a kind of, and it's really interesting because if you think about what would you do, right, if you were there? I think, and that's always a question for me as a historian. It's not a counterfactual. It's a kind of, how do we understand human nature? It is really hard. It's very easy. Sorry, take back. It's very easy for us as historians or as witnesses or readers or thinkers to assign collective blame and collective responsibility. It is, but when you are in the moment, that collective responsibility sort of dissolves because you are an individual just making very limited choices with limited information, and your ability to sort of take on the sort of net of some large-scale responsibility. Yes, we knew about the Holocaust. It kind of dissolves, especially when you're telling your own story. Your own story is about suffering, or your own story is about survival, or about heroism, or I didn't have a choice. And so it was really interesting for me to try to weave together stories of victims, of perpetrators, of bystanders. Those are common categories used in Holocaust and genocide studies, to show how everyone understood themselves. No one goes out saying I'm the bad guy, right? But how do people understand themselves, and how do they understand the other people who are against them? And so that's part of what I did with this story. And what's very interesting is that the Soviets, who march in February, just weeks after this very massive massacre had happened, they find all of these remains of mass graves in the amber pits, because this region produced a lot of amber. There was an amber mine there. Even washed up along the seashore, very hastily buried bodies. And they make the German women of the village dig up the old graves, dig new graves, and have the men help them. And then the Soviet soldiers line up the women, the villagers, along the mass grave and point machine guns at them, as if they're going to basically do what the Germans had been doing all across Europe. Eastern Europe, which was like, okay, you dug the graves, now we're going to shoot you too, and you're going to be piled on top. But then they didn't. And this comes from a German testimony. This man named Rudolf Fulger, who stayed behind, didn't flee. And so the Red Army soldier was a Soviet soldier who was Jewish, spoke to them in German and said, we could do exactly what you did to us. We could do this. We could shoot you because this is what you did to the Jews, but we won't do that because we will not stoop to the level of Hitler's criminals. And you see this line stoop to the level of Hitler's criminals throughout the Soviet understanding of what they're doing and what they're not doing. The Soviets and the Red Army soldiers really think that they are a moral force and a moral force for good. And yet, because, I mean, think about this, 26 million at least, according to current estimates, 26 million Soviet citizens died in the war. They died as soldiers, they died in the Holocaust, they died in civilian occupation, they died in forced labor, etc. And all the ways that the war touched the Eastern Front, that's how Soviet citizens died. After 4.5 years of war, and all of these Red Army soldiers, hungry, marching across Europe in battered boots, they were ready to take their revenge for that. You know, everyone knew someone who had died. You know, everyone had lost something, friends, family, the rest. And so they, in drunken orgies, they raped. And there's no high-level command order, and historians have looked for it. There's no high-level command order. Goebbels blamed Ilya Ehrenberg, the journalist's propaganda, but I think that that's very naive and unsubtle. They were just angry. They were angry for what had been done to them. And they really thought that many of these soldiers thought eye for an eye punishment was fair. Because again, this question of who's responsible, you know, they had this image of fascism, of this layer of the fascist beast. If you can go to the next slide. And so here you see, this is a photo. It says Germany behind it on the left. And then on the right, they've sort of changed it into what goes into the frontline newspapers. It says, soldiers of the Red Army, ahead of you lies the layer of the fascist beast. And so East Prussia was presented as this epicenter of fascism, as this germ seed is the language they use. They claimed that fascism had been born in East Prussia and sort of charted a history of that to say that it later went to Berlin. And so to really motivate soldiers to fight. And so they did. Some historians have estimated that there were 0.6 rapes per soldier. Is that right? I might be getting that statistic wrong. But I think over 80% of the population was raped. The female population was raped in in East Prussia. Most of them were raped multiple times. It would be mass rape, gang rape, people coming in over and over each other, massive spread of sexually transmitted diseases, of course, from this. And a lot of the men were either already absent because they had been mobilized into the Volkssturm or were executed right then.
And so do you think within the Red Army, do you think their attitude when they were attacking this area was one of revenge? Because I mean, at this point, the Red Army are taking back various places. Some they're considering themselves liberating the area. Some it's conquest. Some it's defeating a military. Defending the military ahead of you, and the arena doesn't matter. It's about knocking out those enemy forces. Is there a particular mindset about going into East Prussia, about it being kind of very revengeful? And as you said there, this is the heart of where this ideology started. We have to cut straight the heart of it. Is that prevalent within the army?
Yeah, go ahead to the next slide. That's great transition to that.
Cool.
So the chapter, I have a whole chapter on the Soviet perspective of the invasion of East Prussia, what they thought they were getting into, why they thought they were fighting, and then how they responded. And mostly I use memoirs, but I do have one published diary, and then I also have sort of archival reports, like NKVD reports to Stalin, etc. What they thought they were doing, and the chapter is called Liberation and Revenge. And so that that really gets at it. If you had only 3 words, it's liberation and revenge. If you have more words, it is, as they say, this kind of, I think so many of the histories that have come before really, it just, in Anthony Beaver and Ethan Kershaw, the rest, they're really great historians, but this actually understanding the Soviet worldview and understanding the extreme suffering and the extreme hardship caused by the Nazis, it sometimes gets disconnected. The story of a soldier's revenge, I think they don't fully contextualize that. And I don't mean to rationalize. I don't mean to relativize. I don't mean to forgive rape and pillage and arson and destruction and any violence against civilians ever. but it was really my job as an historian to understand, if that makes sense. And so I looked, sort of not sympathy for the devil, but trying to say, why are they doing what they're doing? And
well, this is maybe a good time to ask you the question about the separation of military history and Holocaust stroke ideological history, because there are some historians that think those subjects should be treated separately, and you deal with Operation Barbarossa in terms of tanks and aircraft and columns of troops pushing in, and then you deal with atrocities and rape and the Holocaust as a separate subject. I'm assuming you think you can't separate the two.
Yeah, I don't think, well, I think it depends on what kind of story you want to tell. I think if, from my perspective, I really wanted to understand human agency, and I really wanted to understand human responses to tragedy. And so I'm a more war and society person than a military historian. That said, I think I think there's definitely room for looking at, operational capacities, strategies, decision making, and that there are histories that can focus on that. But I think that those histories will be richer if they take into account the human costs, the human consequences of those strategies and tactics, And so I think that the issue can also be that, those fields have lots of their own questions and lots of their own, every field starts to become a silo. And I think for me, I never went out, you asked me what kind of historian is. I never went out saying I do cultural history, social history, military history, Holocaust history, because I really wanted to take into account the people. And, and so, it's interesting. I mentioned Bastian Willems, who has written about the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht are actually the characters missing from my story, whereas the Red Army soldiers and the German civilians and later Soviet civilians and Nazi civilian leaders are all sort of character actors. And it was an interesting decision for me to, you have to make limitations. You only get a certain word count. Sometimes you have to sort of paint some things in a broad brush and others not. It's interesting because there are so many military accounts of those last months. Otto Lasch, the general of who commanded Fortress Königsberg, for example, lots of sort of frontline soldiers from the Wehrmacht talking about the sort of tragic defense. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. But I think that responsible storytelling can focus on one angle, but needs to take into account the others, if that makes sense.
I mean, you're right. It's a potential rabbit hole that we don't have time to go down. But for me, if you're tackling the Eastern Front from a military point of view, the fact is the Holocaust, reprisals, atrocities are affecting the decision making. So you can't, the logistics behind Operation Barbarossa, which I keep going to, are because of anti-partisan, which is a label for what was often just genocide going on. But that inability for the Germans to get troops, to get tanks, to get the supplies to the front was because of the policies they're doing, because of the ideology. So you have to look at that. If you don't cover it in your military study, you're not looking at the reason behind decisions being taken. And so you can't separate them. And the sidebar is agreeing with me. Brad from OTD Military History is saying you can't separate them. History Underground JD is saying they're two lanes on the same highway. So
I like that. So, on the same highway, although sometimes people are crossing lanes. I think the reverse.
Crossing lanes. So you're in both lanes at the same time. Yeah, but
I think you're rightly pointing out that military history needs Holocaust history and the sort of consequence. I think the reverse is also true. Is that I think some of the earlier generation. I don't think it's true as much anymore, but some of the earlier scholarship in Holocaust and genocide studies really took out the military. Or there was the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, and I think so many. I mean, I think you've had what's his name? Oh, great part. The guy who just did the myth of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht.
David Harrisburg, I think, wasn't it?
David Harrisburg.
Harrisburg.
And so to think, not only about decision-making ideologies, from the Nazi Party, but then also think about, it's the actual course of the war that does, this is well beyond old functionalist versus intentionalist explanations for the Holocaust. Were they planning it in advance? Can you find it in Mein Kampf? Or was it in the messiness of the war that it unfolded? Yes, the answer is yes, both, both and neither and all of the above. But I think that to understand the way the Holocaust played out, and mass violence and genocide and ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity in general, you have to look at the conduct of the war, because the people at the time were doing so. They were looking at, could they recapture the city? How are they going to evacuate Kharkiv? The rest of it, And so I think that the really rich stories are not bracketing out military history, not just the military history needs the others.
Yeah, no, good point. And and again, it's that we talk about a lot on this channel, is that there is a subset of the demographic who are interested in history, who really just want to keep their interest to Spitfires and tanks, and don't really want to deal with the messiness and the horror and the rape and the atrocities, because it's not that they just want to focus on how cool it is seeing a B-17 flying over, or how cool it is to see a tank running at an event. And of course, behind all that is the ideology and the horror that goes on. But anyway, that's not a separate subject. But back to the presentation. People are enthralled, by the way, so it's really good.
That's great. So back to the Soviet soldiers and what they thought they were doing. And this is something I really explore in my book. And I'm actually, even though I came at this topic by way of Austrian history and the German language, I now teach Russian history, Soviet history. I am, if I have a title, it's historian of the Soviet Union. And so much of my book really deals with that, and I'm kind of engaging with problems in Soviet history. And one of these, if you can see these, it's kind of a little blurry. On the left with this photo with the civilians is a photo from the early 1950s. On the right is a photo that was probably at the end of the war or shortly thereafter. I don't have the date for it. And there are two really amazing quotes that are there. And you can actually, in the photo, you probably can't see it on the slides, but on the one on the right, the quote that is featured on the left is also there, but it's been retraced. So first, on the left, above the man on the right's head, it says, "Теперь ты знаешь, что мир материал." So now you have come to understand that the world is material. So this is Immanuel Kant's grave. It had been bombed by British allied sort of phosphorus bombs in August 44, and the tomb had cracked open, and the rumor had it you could peer in, you could see Kant's bones. And so some soldier has scrawled, "Now you know the world is materials." So Kant is famous for his idealist philosophy. Marx was a materialist. And so this is the triumph of communism. This is a triumph of materialism, of socialism, based on a sort of world revolution understanding of the Soviet project, right? They're bringing communism everywhere because that is the proletarian revolution. It's predestined from history, right?
Right.
And according to that worldview, this kind of what I call an internationalist worldview, which was really prominent in Soviet socialism, they viewed the Germans to be complicit with the Hitler clique. Even the German workers had been corrupted. But the idea was that they could be redeemed because it's workers of the world unite, that even the German workers might be, sort of cured from their sins because through their labor, right? And they could be socialists eventually. Over to the right, on that earlier one, that had faded by the 50s, but in this earlier photo, you can see it. It's that thing in the box. It says, "Did you think that the Russian Ivan would be standing on your grave?" And I find that so charming. And so, those of you who are familiar with the Eastern Front, it was often cast in the Soviet imagery as Ivan versus Fritz, or Ivan in Russian. And so Ivan is this archetype of the peaceful Slavic peasant, the sort of upstanding Red Army soldier, often blonde, who's there defending the motherland against this preternaturally evil, this sort of like technologically capable German Fritz, the sort of stock character of a German baddie. And so they really presented the war in ethno-national terms as this ancient continuing battle of, Slavs versus Teutons, et cetera. And this was a defense of the motherland, and this was a defense of Russian identity. And that is really complex in the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was multi-ethnic. And so sometimes it would sort of get overlayered, so that Russianness could kind of be transposed for Sovietness as a whole, and yet they would also promote their multi-ethnic identity. But these two quotes help understand what the Soviet Union thought they were doing, what they thought they were doing when they were marching across East Prussia, and what they thought they were doing after, which is this combination of internationalism, everyone can become socialist, and a combination of nationalism, which is this is Russians versus Germans. This is us versus them. And so go ahead to the next slide. After the war, it's such a complex story, but I'm going to boil it down. After the war, this northern third of East Prussia went to the Soviet Union. It went to the USSR. There had been, during the wartime conferences, Tehran, Yalta,
Yep.
all of the allies, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, had agreed that East Prussia was a disaster. The corridor was a disaster. They also agreed eventually that Prussian militarism was to blame for everything. And they thought that in order for the post-war world to work out, East Prussia should not be on the map. And neither would there be a Prussia. And they got rid of the Prussian state too. And so what to do with it was a bigger question. And eventually they just sort of, through various geopolitical tit for tats and trades and this and that, they decided that Poland, because part of the population had spoken Polish, would get the 2/3 at the bottom, the Masurian region. That little region that Lithuania had claimed in 1923 at gunpoint, they got it back, but by then it was part of the Soviet Union. But this middle region that had been ethnically mostly German, they couldn't just leave it there. Stalin claimed it as an ice-free port. Now that's funny because this port wasn't actually ice-free, but he said, the Soviet Union could really use an ice-free port, and we've sacrificed so much, and after all, this is ancient Slavic soil anyway, so give it to us. And this was an offhand quote that Stalin had said, oh, this is ancient Slavic soil, and Churchill's like, okay, sure, whatever, you guys have sacrificed a lot of blood in this region, Napoleonic Wars and World War I and now, and so yes, you can have it. This was supposed to be, the terms were supposed to be figured out in a peace treaty after the war, but after Potsdam, there was never a peace treaty, and it just sort of defaulted to the Soviet Union. Go ahead to the next slide.
We just have a question from James Murphy about the naming. Was it named after Mikhail Kalinin? And if it was that kind of a statement? Because you can see the question yourself. I mean, it goes back to Katyn, and is it a statement, the name?
It was not about Katyn. It was about Mikhail Kalinin. Kalinin happened to have died right before they renamed it. They were there were debates about the renaming of that city, of Königsberg, and for the first year after the war, from April 45 when it was captured to April 46, it was named Königsberg in Russian. And they were going to name it, they had settled on the name Baltisk, which is actually what Pillau was renamed. So there is a Baltisk in the region, but it was going to basically named Baltic place, the Baltic, it was going to be named Baltic basically. There had been proposals early on to name it Slavgorod, which would be like City of Slavs, but they put that down. Like, no, that's it's a little too overt. We're not quite that ethno-nationalist yet, but that later played out. But no, the Kalinin it just happened to be that he died right then. And they're like, you know what, let's celebrate that guy. So It wasn't about Katyn.
Okay,
although
thank you.
More about his death. Okay, so going ahead. The place that the Soviets inherited was, I'm going to speed up a little bit for the post-war period, but I want to point out that it's about half of the book. And so I really go into the on the ground, sort of what does it mean to rebuild a city after war, if you're interested in reading more. About 90% of the city center was destroyed, 60% of the city as a whole. This was really a race against death. The Red Army, the 3rd Belarusian Front's 11th Guards Army stayed behind to occupy the city and that northern part of the territory that became Soviet. And it was really just a struggle to survive with very few resources, with no instructions from above what to do, because Kaliningrad was like 1% of all of the territory coming into the Soviet sphere of influence, either annexed to the Soviet Union directly, like Western Ukraine, the Baltics, or like what would be the future satellite states in Eastern Europe. And so this was a place that Stalin had maneuvered to get, but once he had it, he did absolutely nothing. There are all kinds of letters locally to the military command in Berlin, to Moscow, to the Kremlin, saying, what do we do? How do we rebuild this place? And most of all, there were upwards of 200,000, somewhere between 150 and 200,000 Germans remaining behind in this region. And they were all going hungry and infested with sexually transmitted diseases and even epidemic diseases like typhoid fever and malaria. And so it was just this wasteland of hardship. And it was much worse than almost anywhere else in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe, far worse than anywhere else in the Soviet zone of occupation or in the future West Germany, because the wartime occupation had begun early and had lasted longer. It was just this sort of holding pattern of destruction. And so the spring planting hadn't happened, all the rest. So this was a horrifying task to try to rebuild this place. And the 11th Guards Army that became the special military district organizing the occupation, they were given virtually no funding and were told to just resurrect it, go for it.
And a quick question again: were
Sure.
there children? I mean, the mass rapes that have been occurring earlier. Were there lots of children around? And do we know any data of how many were born through Russian rape or Soviet rape, I should say?
Yeah, I don't have data about the number of children. I do have anecdotal accounts, many of them from German doctors, because they were German doctors and nurses were often those who stayed behind because they stayed with the military hospitals. They would get captured, etc. And so what was the case was there were many pregnancies, not a lot of them coming to term because of the extreme trauma, hardship, disease. And this is the case. This is not only the case locally, but often the case in times of very hard occupations, which is that a lot of the pregnancies don't come to term. Okay. There were pregnancies that came to term from the rape, also from marriages of convenience and love and cohabitation that happened after the war. And so there were a number of mixed children, German Soviet children born, and I'll get to that. Almost all of them were expelled with their mothers because the Germans weren't allowed to stay after 47, 48.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide. And so the old city center had been built around a ring, and you can see that. That being that mostly destroyed, it was an old, it was like a early 20th century, late 19th century suburb that became the new city center. And so that's the place where the city's new life was rebuilt. And it was also very heavily destroyed, but not as bad. And it's actually the center of Kaliningrad today. So there was a hope to remove the city back to where the roads would make sense, you know, and sort of radiating from a ring, but they still haven't succeeded in it. So go ahead from there.
Okay, hang on. Yep. Sorry, couldn't find my mouse for a second. Yep, there we go.
Whereas Königsberg's Nazis had been sort of these aristocrats, these elites, these theorists of Nazism, and had sort of imagined Nazism locally, the new Soviet rulers of what becomes Kaliningrad tended to be not the fathers of their revolution, but the children. They were the beneficiaries of Stalinist socialism. They'd grown up in the Soviet Union or had spent their formative years in the Soviet Union if they were older. And they tended to be overwhelmingly military veterans, most of whom had fought for East Prussia and had just stayed there. Later, more civilians come in to help run the government. And so it's a very interesting shift in dynamic in that they are not very self-conscious about what socialism means, but have it intuitive because they've lived it, because they've experienced it in the war, because they experienced it in their schooling in the 1930s. And they bring that socialism, or what they imagine, you know, Stalinist socialism to look like, to Kaliningrad. The biggest problem and the biggest way that got shaped on the ground, and we really know this in recent research, is it used to be, you know, sort of during the Cold War, there was this assumption that sort of Sovietization meant, you know, this like a plan from above that was just sort of mapped and oppressively onto all the local populations, and it would just sort of be, you know, like a factory template. Now we know that Stalinization was really messy, really dependent on local context, looked different, and the pathways to it often look different, and even the outcomes look different depending on the place. And so go ahead to the next slide. The main determinant for the early shape of socialism and Sovietization in Kaliningrad was the presence of the Germans that I mentioned, you know, somewhere between 150 and 200,000 at the end of the war. By their final expulsion in late 1948, the English language literature, borrowing from German emigre reports, had claimed that 75% of them had died. I can only say with confidence somewhere between 40 and 50%. The number might be higher, but when I'm actually looking at death statistics and population statistics with Soviet sources, at least half, probably around half of the Germans did not survive the post-war period because of that hardship. And so what is so fascinating to me, as I mentioned, is that Germans were being expelled spontaneously elsewhere in Eastern Europe. They were actually encouraged in the early summer of 45 to go back to Königsberg. And then after Potsdam, the borders were closed and they weren't allowed to leave even if they wanted to. And there'd been a lot of speculation by Germanists, German historians, that this was a kind of forced labor regime, that they either didn't care about the Germans at all and just sort of left them there to starve, or that they intentionally used them for their labor to rebuild the city and then spit them out when they were done with them. And my research just doesn't back that up, that idea, because what I saw was in very decentralized, very messy ways, the Soviets are trying to convert the Germans. They're trying to integrate them into the system. They're trying to get them to work harder to rebuild in order to make life better. And that early on, they considered Germans to be the beneficiaries of this new system that they're building. And so I want to go into a few ways that they did that very quickly, and I spent a lot more time on this in my book. So go ahead to the next image. So there was a forced labor regime. There were forced labor regime in all the occupied zones. You know, the Americans also used it in Kaliningrad. What becomes Kaliningrad, it was much more harsh. It was every single day of the week for 10 to 11 hours of the day versus like 1 day a week. But that was because the region had no funding. That was because there was a dire, basically, demographic catastrophe about to happen if they did not revive the city and its agriculture immediately. And so the problem was, though, as you can see from this picture, there's a Soviet overseer, but all of the workers are women because older men and younger men had been drafted, had already been taken as POWs, and there were actually some POW camps early on in Kaliningrad. But the civilian laborers were women, and often women with children, or women who were taking care of elderly people at home and only being able to provide rations, not enough for the whole family because only workers got rations. But the Soviets used the language of socialism. If you work hard, you will earn your keep. If you work hard, you will overfulfill the plan. You will get more bread, more food. There wasn't actually enough to go around to do that often in practice, but there was this sort of idea that you could rehabilitate yourself. And so they tried to use that there. Go ahead to the next slide. They also, as a civilian government was established in mid-1946, they tried to draw the Germans into a Soviet budget. They had equal pay for equal work. Here's the picture of German doctors and nurses in a hospital, taking in a pediatric wing, taking care of children. They had conferences to have German and Soviet doctors working together. They created schools for German children where they taught them in German. They had all kinds of early on paper attempts to try to build social service networks for the German population, thinking of them as possibly going to be living there long term. And then go ahead to the next slide.
A question for you. The parameters of what is German, were they fluid at the time? Because you said earlier about in the early area about Germany is kind of being German is like a state of mind. It's a declaration. Right. So with this port city, there must have been intermarriages, and people are bilingual or trilingual, and or they've got one faith, and the partner has a different faith, or that. So was it fluid? The definition. Who decided whether you're German or not?
Well, this is what's so interesting, and this is the irony that I sort of carry out to the book, and that is I speak to with the title "German Blood, Slavic Soil." Yeah. So in Nazism, the idea is it's supposed to be about blood, but in East Prussia, it becomes about a matter of will, right? That it's about self-determination and voluntarism. It's like what you think, right? And so you can choose to be a German, which is fascinating, right? Of course, there are contradictions, and that gets chipped away at, right? This region that becomes what is called today Kaliningrad Oblast. Oblast just means province or district in Russian. Kaliningrad Oblast, that region that goes to the Soviet Union was mostly homogeneously German and not part of the mixed regions that went to either Lithuania or to Poland. However, among the population, there were forced laborers, there were international POWs, there were lots of other peoples there, but of the pre-war population that remained, they were mostly homogeneously ethnically German. That said, many of them had last names that could indicate other ancestry, especially Polish and Lithuanian, and so they were very demonstrable. I'll get to a little bit about how that plays out at the end. And so, but they are all basically considered German, and including there's a very famous memoir, a beautiful memoir, and it's translated in English called A Childhood Under Hitler and Stalin. It was it was a half Jewish boy, Jewish on his mother's side, German, non-Jewish on his dad's side. The family was persecuted during the Third Reich, but because of this Mischling status, were not deported, did not end up in the concentration camps, and remained in Kaliningrad. And so he was, even though he had been Jewish, even though he'd worn the Star of David, had worked in the chemical factories, had almost died many times, he was just considered a German by the Soviets because, like, well, you all the Jews are dead. You would not have, like you must have been collaborating, right? Otherwise, why would you be here? And so he ended up experiencing the oppression of both. But he later became a violinist. Really, just really insightful and really compassionate. And I weave his story throughout the book. They basically thought of any civilians as Germans. That later becomes complicated. So they have this hospital. Go ahead to the next slide. The final way that they tried to integrate the Germans, and I should say that they're doing all this because unlike the future East Germany, what becomes the German Democratic Republic, unlike Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Ukraine, any other place coming under the Soviet sphere of influence, directly or indirectly, there were not Germans waiting in the wings saying, we are committed anti-fascists and we will now run the government. It was the Soviet military running the government. The Germans had no role in the government. Therefore, they had no rights or recourse, no voice. They just remained an occupied population. And so there are all these attempts to convert them from their fascist complicity, to show them the superiority of socialism, to even include them in the socialist system. But there was the baseline suspicion because they had not been declared Soviet citizens or Lithuanian Soviet citizens, etc. They were not redeemed en masse from fascism. So they were still baseline, locally, they still thought, you're still guilty, and so individually they would maybe redeem themselves, but how do you know, right? How would you know when someone has been redeemed from fascism? So they tried to educate them directly. This gets mocked off in this Neue Zeit, New Times newspaper. It was sort of translations of Pravda, but it had local German enthusiasts writing for it to say, the crimes of fascism, the superiority of socialism. So they went around giving lectures around the province. They had a German anti-fascist club for Kaliningrad's teachers and doctors, etc., and tried to convert them through the good news, of how Soviet Union was superior. Now, all of these, go to the next slide. All of these efforts had all kinds of internal contradictions. Sometimes they were, only on paper. Others were only just being implemented by late 46, when a number of factors coalesced and tipped the scales from integration to marginalization and exclusion, meaning they started to scapegoat the Germans and call them a problem. The first was Moscow, which had very little interactivity with what was happening in Kaliningrad and had no idea what was going on, nonetheless organized a centralized settlement campaign to relieve pressure from other war-torn regions. And so they sent, by the end of 1946, early 47, over 200,000 new Soviet settlers, mostly from Western Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, so mostly from Slavic regions, to settle Kaliningrad to work in its collective farms. Now, this was a disaster for a couple of reasons. One is that this happened after the harvest. They all came, the population nearly tripled, basically, from what the remaining Germans were at the time, but with no food stores for winter. It was one of the coldest winter on record. It was a winter famine across the Soviet Union. And what it meant was there were all of these new settlers, barely established, with no food. They all went hungry, but because of an ethnic hierarchy, because Soviets were citizens and Germans were, what were they, who knew, Germans starved to death. And so Germans were dying out in the streets. It was sort of a repetition of the Leningrad blockade, but in reverse. These new settlers, if you can go on to the next slide, some of them would come voluntarily, some of them would come only semi-voluntarily because they had to be recruited and sent. They were promised all kinds of things. They were promised tax-free transit and free cow, housing. They were told that this was a rich place lined with fruit trees, and they got there and they saw the ruins of Kaliningrad, and it was often worse than the place they had come from, which was already war-torn and devastated. And so this is a clipping from a newspaper. It says, "Great plan, but disappointing reality." There was suddenly pressure from below, from these new Soviet settlers, saying, "Why haven't you rebuilt Kaliningrad? It's been like a year and a half after the war. This place is a disaster." And then there was also pressure from above as this region was incorporated into the city government. New accountability from Moscow, from all kinds of agencies, from the party, where there had never been before. So from above and below, people are saying, why is Kaliningrad not being rebuilt? Why is the city still in ruins? And so the new party leaders who had many of them just come, where they had been focusing on the Germans as beneficiaries, on trying to improve their productivity, on telling the Germans that the city would be rebuilt. Suddenly the Germans look like a fifth column in a vulnerable minority population in a city now filled with Soviet settlers. And they scapegoated the Germans. They called them saboteurs, enemies from within, wreckers. When Germans stole potatoes, that was evidence of treason against the Soviet state. Germans, even in that spring of 47, because of the winter famine, were turning to cannibalism and sort of eating dead flesh and dead bodies. But the Soviets said that their cannibalism and even their deaths, like their bodies lying out on the streets in the frozen snow, were proof that the Germans, not that the Soviet Union had failed to provide and that it was doing less well than the civilization that had come before, but that the Germans were still corrupted by fascism, and that fascism was literally, figuratively, somewhere a disease in the body, and so that they had lost the will to survive because of their lingering fascism. And so that was proof of it, if you can imagine it. So go ahead to the next slide. This all led in the spring of 1947 to a local drive to expel the German population. They cast them as these fascist contaminants, that the very presence of the Germans and of Germanness was stopping Kaliningrad from becoming socialist. And this was all this very dramatic turn, whereas they had originally thought of the Germans as an audience or as the population to convert and to be the beneficiaries of the labor. Now they were the obstacles to Kaliningrad being built. And so there was this witch hunt there where they were looking for Germanists anywhere. They were trying to fire Germans from the workplace, even though they had labor shortages in many industries. They would then try to eliminate Germanness from the street signs, from the shape of the houses, from the very German appearance and very East Prussian appearance of the architecture. But what happened was that because socialism was this combination of Russians versus Germans and this kind of internationalist version that I talked about, all of those elements of socialism got kind of mixed together. And so whereas it used to be that socialism was about providing a better life for the population, about, welfare, education, all of these things, social safety net stuff, it ended up becoming about eliminating Germanists. And so anything that looked German or the Germans themselves was fascist. And it didn't even matter. Like a lot of the buildings they would call fascist were built by, someone who had actually fled the Nazis and was building communist housing in East Germany by that point. So it didn't matter what it was. If it was German, it was fascist, right? And anything, because socialist, in terms of technological modernity and better society, couldn't be built, they just made socialism about making things look Russian. And so they Russified everything. So they would rebuild the buildings if they could to make it look like a Stalinist Russian style building, and that's socialist. And so they started to define socialism in this binary with anti-fascism. And I'm not going to go into detail, but you can imagine how that legacy and confusion about anti-fascism and fascism could have echoes in the war in Ukraine today, where denazification is the same as protecting ethnic Russians. And those things don't really make sense until you understand that in this context. So I want to go to the last slide now, which is some takeaways very quickly. which is from how, I tell this very narrative history, and I tried to make it accessible to not just, historians interested in the fine details, but, interesting as a story, hopefully to all audiences who are interested in the war. What I learned was really the importance of local context. This place is a port city. This place is a borderland of two empires. Really did shape the way that Nazism was played out and the way that Stalinism played out. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to go back to that German blood, Slavic soil, the definition of Germanness. I forgot to mention that.
Yep.
At the end, they expelled all the Germans. It was a local drive from Kaliningrad. Moscow later made the decision, yes, we'll do this, because Kaliningrad was in hysterics about it. And they expelled all the Germans. Every last German had to go because they declared that the Germans were irredeemable, that they could not be converted from fascism, and that basically fascism was their inner core. The irony, of course, right, is as soon as they get off the train in the Soviet zone of occupation, the first future East Germany, they can be good communists once they're there, and so what happens is that anyone who is German is irredeemable. The very few people who get to stay are those German women who, not always, but occasionally, who had fallen in love with a Soviet, usually a Soviet veteran soldier, who had enough clout to be able to say, you know what, this woman, my lover, is not a German at all. She's a Lithuanian. It doesn't matter that she doesn't speak Lithuanian. She's a Lithuanian, because Lithuanians had been declared en masse liberated from Nazism. If you were a Lithuanian, you could be socialist. You could be Soviet. You could take on Soviet citizens. They said, oh, she's lost her documents. And that was the only way to do it. That often didn't work, but if someone had the clout, they could declare you not German. And that's the only way that you could be in this place as it became Russian equals socialist. The only way you could be socialist if you were part of a nation that was in the Soviet Union. And so that's the irony, is that whereas Germanness had been a matter of will in Nazism, in Kaliningrad, in Soviet Kaliningrad, you could not choose to be socialist. You could choose, because you could not choose to be Russian. And ultimately, so that the parallel there of ethno-nationalism underlying Soviet socialism makes it very similar to what Nazism was about, ironically. So the role of local context, the role of geography, right? As this port city, as this region, it really dictates what happens in both regimes. Inclusion and exclusion, and that's what I just commented about, is that the ironies about who gets to belong really get played out in local context, and you can really see the role of the ways in which the national community is shaped in both Nazism and Stalinism. And then finally, it's really only through war, and it's only through the escalation of violence that you see these internal contradictions. That, Nazism, that Stalinism, they can paper over all of the weird contradictions in those ideologies, but when war kind of, put not the pedal to the metal, to test the metal. I'm missing my cliches right now. It's only those heightened tensions that's when they become revealed. So anyway, thank you so much. I'd love to have any more questions, and I appreciate your time.
Well, it's been brilliant, and the sidebar has been suitably impressed, because I can tell when they're listening, because they're quiet. But but it's also the complexity for me is the fact that this obviously is it's ongoing history, as you say. You've referenced what's happening in Ukraine right now, and it's like we can debate decisions are made at the Battle of El Alamein because the facts haven't changed in the 80 years. We can look at this army was here, this army was there, but it involves so much about identity and identities that change, and these concepts that are, I as an Englishman living in France, when people say, where are you from? So what do you mean? Where do I live? What's my nationality? It depends on the question you ask, and the context is how I define myself. So all of this about Russianness, about Germanness, about being from a Baltic city, it's complicated and complex. And how? So in the writing and research process, I'm assuming you started this before anything happened in Ukraine. So
I finished the conclusion of this book, the final draft, 2 weeks after the war broke out in 2022.
Wow.
So, of course I was writing it, with Russia in the Donbass ever since 2014. But I chose not to change a word. Everything was unfolding so quickly, and I suddenly saw all of the resonance, because Putin was already declaring this was a battle against Nazism and about sort of fascism, and I had seen him do that over the past decades, talking about sort of the germ seed of fascism, or the vaccination against fascism, not having fully succeeded in Europe. And so this is long, Soviet historians had seen this a lot, about how after World War II, the Soviet Union, which had previously relied on the myth of 1917 and World Revolution, was relying on this myth of fascism. Myth not mean untrue, but basically a story of who we are and why we exist. We beat Nazism. We are good because we are anti-fascist. And I knew that was part of the story, but to see it mobilized so cynically and so powerfully by Putin, I almost wanted to rewrite parts of the book and point to it. But I'm glad I let the book stand on its own terms.
Yeah, and that's going to be an ongoing discussion for Eastern Front historians as how over the next few years, and we obviously don't know what the outcome of Ukraine is going to be right now, but there hopefully will be some kind of resolution to it at some point, and how that the perceptions from this era will affect how the Eastern Front is written about. I mean, there was that era, 10, 20 years ago when you talked about D-Day or Operation Anzio, you had to make the point that for every German soldier killed on the Western Front, don't forget 9 were killed by the Soviets. And now that we're moving away from that again now it's look how much we did on our own. We're trying to move, not take out the Soviet contribution, but slightly push it into the shade a little bit. These are these ongoing discussions that make it so fascinating. The people say, why are you still talking about World War II? It's all in the past. Well, it is in the past, but the repercussions, the outcomes, the legacies are as relevant today as they were 80 years ago.
I was just Mark Galeotti, who does a podcast on Russia. He's great if anyone's interested in the current events about what's going on in Russia today. He's a total policy wonk, but also someone who's written about Putin's wars, and so he does a lot of he has a great knowledge of the military, more than most Russia experts. Just actually did an episode on Kaliningrad, because there have been a lot of tit-for-tat NATO exercises, and he points out, a lot of Russians are talking about the Suwalki Gap. This, it's a sort of a reverse play of the Polish corridor. This idea that there's just this small strip of land separating Belarusia, which is basically, Russia at this point, Russia too. At this point, from Kaliningrad. And so Kaliningrad today has assumed, once again, like for the third time, in 100 years, a very geopolitically strategic importance in the terms of the shape of the map of Europe. And it's a fascinating divide. It was the same as it was in the 20th century, is this tension between this region being like this this Russian military stronghold. The image in the West is like they can nuke us from Kaliningrad, but it's also an extremely vulnerable place, that where the people there are undergoing great economic hardship now, because once again, the sort of exclave has cut off trade, and it's the food prices have gone up, and it's a region, that until recently depended on its electricity from another country. The nuclear power plant was in Lithuania. And so I think we're going to see some of these same debates about this particular region and its future. And I hope, for the sake of humanity, that Kaliningrad does not change hands and go back to Germany, or go to Poland, or go to Lithuania, or whatever, because that would mean World War III. I see that often thrown around on Twitter. They should give it back to blah, blah, blah. I was like, anything that means Kaliningrad is changing hands is bad for humanity, because that means a lot of death and destruction and violence. That sort of thing can't happen peacefully. And so,
good point, Nicole. And also,
you don't want to see Kaliningrad change hands. That's going to be ugly.
Yeah, and you've reminded us all that at the bottom of all these stories are victims. Regardless of the ideology that's above them, they may not even have any say in its being there. There's victims. I mean, I'm not going to start talking about Palestine and Gaza and Israel now, but there are. The victimhood is universal, isn't it? And we can, hopefully, most of us who are intelligent can be sympathetic to victims, regardless of who, what group we assign them to. We can recognize
and whatever hand they might have had in a previous perpetration, right? People remain human beings,
Yeah.
including people who have done something bad. Yeah.
My last question is, what next on the horizon in terms of books and work? Obviously, you're busy teaching, but is there another subject that you'll reveal to us?
Yeah, I'm basking in the glow of having finished a book, and that glow has gotten ever longer. I am toying with an idea about, I've got a lot of projects I'm interested in, but one of them is about how medical knowledge got generated from war. So basically, Kaliningrad is the site of this, I kind of liken it to a petri dish, or isolation is this closed environment that is a cesspool for disease of all kinds. And Germans there are commenting on it and later talking about it as this sort of like greatest epidemic disease space in Europe. And they later become epidemiologists. They later write papers about this. And I realized this is the same in the Warsaw Ghetto, where Jewish doctors use the sort of self-experimentation of watching their own bodies starve to then learn about nutrition science. And they write about that after the war. And so I'm hoping, I'm at the very early stages of this, I'm hoping to sort of trace a transnational history of how these sort of forced encampment and contained spaces of war generate knowledge about the human body by the participants themselves. So not just sort of like Mengele and evil experiments, but actually people who have experienced their own hardship, like people from the Leningrad blockade. And so that's it's a bummer, but another project that is sort of growing out of this one.
Well, that sounds really exciting, but we will leave it there. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you, Nicole. So, folks, I remind you the link to the book is in the description below, or you can buy it at your favorite bookstore. We've got a Masters of the Air panel discussion tomorrow. John McManus, John Short, and Luke Truxler joining us to talk about how the series portrayed the kind of strategic bombing campaign and the wider World War II. I'm looking forward to that. And we have another show with Dan Ellin about the Bomber Command coming up later in the week. So lots of things coming. So click like and subscribe. Share what we're doing with your friends. Go out and buy the books of my guests, because that's how they earn their pennies to write their other books. And thank everybody for your fantastic questions. Thank you, Nicole. Thank everybody. I will see you again tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.